find it extraordinary that people who play instruments don't also improvise and compose. It just seems bizarre. And in fact, in classical music, they did until really the 20th century. You can't start from nothing. That's not how it works. It's not as if you're sitting there waiting for inspiration. If suddenly a sort of thunderbolt from the sky is going to come down, and you're going to write down your piece of genius music. It all just comes from.
I'm Daniel Nistico from the Creative Guitarist podcast, where we explore composing, improvising, arranging, and career tips for our new generation of players and musicians. I'm here with Steve Goss, who's been described by the International Record Review as one of the guitar's finest living composers. Steve is Professor of Composition at the University of Surrey, UK, and a Professor of Guitar at the Royal Academy of Music in London, where I was just a couple months ago. Steve's music has been performed and recorded by many leading guitarists, ensembles, and orchestras. There's so many names that I'll just let you, listen away to those people. It's not very often that we see guitarists who compose for such a wide array of instruments and genres. BBC Music Magazine stated that Goss weaves together an eclectic range of influences, at once retrospective and forward-looking. I'm always fascinated and inspired by composers who write for the guitar without being limited by the instrument's norms and capabilities. Many of the classical guitar's great works were composed by musicians who wrote outside of the guitar, such as Fernando Sor, Mario Castelnuovo Tedesco, Heitor Villalobos, Leo Brouwer, some names that come to mind. So it's my absolute honor and privilege to speak with a musician, a composer who's currently at the forefront of writing the next generation of guitar music. Welcome to the podcast, Steve. Thanks for coming.
No, thank you for having me, Daniel. It's great to be here. Great to have a chance to talk to you about all manner of things.
Yeah, I'm really excited to pick your brain here. I've done a bit of research. You have a lot of great interviews and information on your website. I just want to already quickly plug your website. There's a great treasure trove of articles and interviews there. So good stuff. So it's given me some good ammo, for our interview. So, all right. So the first question I've got for you is that the guitar is sometimes thought of as a limited piano or harp. You've described the guitar as halfway between harmony and melody, and also as having quirks and effects. I think you used the term smoke and mirrors as well. How much of an influence does our perception of the instrument have on how we compose, or how much of an influence does it have on you as well?
Okay, so this is the whole hour podcast on this one question. It's a huge topic and one I'm really, really interested in. It's a sort of idiomatic aspect of instruments and music. So there's a wonderful researcher called Jonathan D'Souza who has recently written a book called Music at Hand. It's from 2017, and it takes this topic full on. He describes instruments as being like a kind of creative prosthesis, part of a body, and that basically the way that we think about music is entirely shaped by the instrument we play. You wonder why the keyboard players and organists are best at harmony. Well, it's because, the way their brains have developed while learning those instruments. So it's kind of, absolutely key. The guitar is a really weird special case. I know we keep saying this and we think we're special, but it's a hard instrument to write for, even if you're a guitarist. I find it much easier to write for just about any other instrument than the guitar. The bandoneon is an exception, and the organ is pretty complicated. But on the whole, the guitar is horribly restrictive. Because as soon as you put one finger down on the instrument, where you can reach from there is extremely limited. And what we do as guitar composers, which annoys the hell out of you, like composers who aren't guitarists, is that we make it sound like all sorts of things are possible on the guitar and sound quite natural. But it's really a trick of the eye. It really is smoke and mirrors. We sort of play things which are stupendously idiomatic, and sound amazingly impressive and complex, but aren't actually that hard to do. When you come from the outside and try and write music as a non-guitarist, it's almost impossible to get close to it. And that's partly why our whole repertoire is so much shaped by guitarist composers. There are very, very, very few non-guitarist composers who've got anything like enough instrumental knowledge and understanding of the idiom to make it work. Obvious examples are Benjamin Britten, Toru Takemitsu, Stephen Dodgson, the English composer, was another one. But it's a strange instrument because it's not a melody instrument and it's not really a harmony instrument, and it can't really do counterpoint, but we pretend it's all three. The guitars are very good at playing melodies. They're very good at playing chordal accompaniments, very good at playing bass lines. So in a way, a guitar trio is the ultimate because the guitar can do all three things at once in a way that's compelling and convincing. But the problem comes when we try and imagine that the guitar is a solo instrument, like the piano is a solo instrument, or like the harp is a solo instrument. Those are instruments where you have two hands and a lot of kind of freedom. I mean, you take a piece that only advanced guitarists can play. Our little prelude in D minor for guitar at Bach, it's BWV 999. On the keyboard in C minor, it's something that people play when they're 9 years old. A little 9 years old, 10-year-old student will play that piece, no problem at all. On the guitar, it's incredibly difficult because whereas the pianist has two hands, we basically have one.
Mm.
So, it is an oddity as an instrument. And we suffer because of that. And I think what's really interesting is that when there are more and more composers now who are general composers, not guitarists, have learned on guitar. Guitar is a much more sort of
Mm.
popular instrument than it was for composers. And you look around and you see some of the biggest names in composition, and they come from a guitar base. We may not know them as a guitarist, but Dave Fennessy in Scotland, for example, is one that immediately comes to mind. And there are others too who've either had a past in rock music or folk music and have guitar knowledge. And the one thing that they and I say we all agree on is that writing for a string quartet gives you an enormous amount of freedom.
Mm.
Writing for a solo guitar does not. It's a trap. It's a kind of it's it's a bit like cage fighting, which is you're incredibly restricted space. There's very little you can do, but in a way, I guess one of the most exciting things about the guitar is trying to make interesting music despite all the restrictions that are imposed on you.
Mm. Very interesting, very fascinating. I think your comments will give a bit of comfort to those who have maybe tried to write for the guitar,
Mm.
composers who aren't guitarists. Yeah, because I've met some, and they do seem to at first have quite a bit of struggle at knowing, how to voice chords and what sort of techniques to use and how many
Mm.
notes we can play at one time and things like that. So,
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we do a project with the composers at the Royal Academy in London every year, the masters composers, with writing for guitar. And if people have no experience with the instrument, I always suggest by starting off by writing a piece for two guitars, because
mm,
at least then you can have low notes and high notes together and not have to worry too much about whether things are
yeah.
possible in terms of stretches and so on.
Mm.
Um, but people find that useful because then, in a sense, a guitar duo is more like a piano or a harp because you've got two hands, as it were. And that's why so much piano music sounds great on two guitars, whereas it doesn't necessarily always work in the same way on one.
I know you've got some interesting thoughts about arranging and composition. So you've said that compositions are arrangements to some extent, and that you're interested in the grey area between where arrangements stop and compositions begin. So can you
Yeah,
elaborate on that, please?
absolutely. I mean, the first thing to say is to put my cards on the table is that I find it extraordinary that people who play instruments don't also improvise and compose. It just seems bizarre. And in fact, in classical music, they did until really the 20th century. All the great virtuosi of the 19th century also composed. And in all other cultures, and in popular cultures, people compose, they improvise, they perform. It's all part of the same thing. And so I find it kind of extraordinary that people don't do it. That's the first thing.
Mm.
But also, I think that there's a kind of precious idea of somehow it's a 19th century idea of the composer as kind of creative genius, as if in some way composers are special. And I can tell you that they're absolutely not in any way, shape, or form. And somehow this kind of hallowed approach to the composer as genius and the idea that the score is some kind of sacred text that mustn't be tampered with is just utter bullshit. It's a kind of fantasy that is sort of still in place. And it's like, you know, if you have a composer working in the Baroque period, for instance, the notation is there's a lot of shorthand in it. There's a lot of improvising that goes on, a lot of adapting, a lot of changing. In the modern world, we've got lead sheets, and jazz musicians can just look at a lead sheet, get together, and create any number of different versions of that piece. They're not arrangements; they're playing the piece. And I see a sort of continuum of creativity, whereas other people see them as separate items. So, for example, you could take performance on one level and composition on the other, as if they're polar opposites. Whereas, in fact, as a performer, we often will transcribe music that we need to play.
Mm.
And then we try to be, in some way kind of true to an original version, try and replicate that. And then we might think, well, we could change a few things. And then we get into the arranging world, thinking, well, if this composer was going to write this piece for guitar, they wouldn't write it like this. What would they do? Blah, blah, blah. And then you get into thinking, well, maybe I could take this and actually do something else with it and take it to a different direction. I mean, I think one of the most creative ways to practice is improvising around the pieces that you're learning, so that you're not necessarily playing all the time exactly what it says on the page, but actually getting to know the piece through kind of understanding the gestures and the character of the piece and the kind of sound you might want to produce, which comes through improvising. And again, as a player, taking a score for a walk, um, is a great idea. Just sitting down and think, well, what else can I do with this? What else is possible here? Thomas Addis, a British composer, when he was in his early 20s, took a Dowland piece, In Darkness Let Me Dwell, the song, and he basically exploded it at the piano, just kept all the notes the same, but changed all the octaves, changed the dynamics, changed the texture, created this piece which sounds nothing like the original. I mean, is it an arrangement? Is it a composition? What is it? It's kind of, a mixture. And also, there's no originality. There's no point trying to be original. The only time you hear something you think is original is because you just don't know what the influences are. Everything is about this kind of constant regurgitation, constantly looking at things from a different angle. There are no new objects. There's just objects you thought were familiar to you, and you're seeing them from an unfamiliar angle for the first time. So I think that there's a sort of, this sort of separation is not really helpful. The idea that some people, interpret and others compose. And the other thing I would say, which is very closely related to this, is that if there's a hierarchy, the performer is much higher up than the composer. The performers are they are the alchemists. They turn ordinary notes on a paper, Google Maps, recipes, into glorious cities, glorious meals. And some of the people I've worked with do things with my music that I'd never have dreamt of, and certainly would never be able to do as an interpreter myself. They'll take it to a different level, and I think we massively underestimate this creative artistry that performers have. And this idea that they're trying to sort of do service to the composer is just like um, it's 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 entirely the wrong way of looking at it, I would say, in my view.
Wow, excellent. A lot of food for thought here, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I've started a online school called the Creative
Mm,
Classical Guitarist in an effort to try and help encourage guitarists to pursue a little bit of creativity, composing, arranging, improvising. And from what I've seen, it is very accessible. It's very easy, especially if you've been playing the instrument for a long time. A lot of people are, I think, taken aback just at how like you said, it's you, yeah, you don't need to be like born with this special gift of you're a composer at birth,
no.
and that's and no one no if that doesn't happen, there's no chance that or like you'll if you compose, you must compose. It must be as great as Bach and Beethoven, and um, we put these very high expectations on ourselves and unrealistic expectations,
Mm,
and I think what you said there about taking what you already know, pieces you already know, and playing with them, taking them for a walk, that was a great
mm.
analogy, and that's something I teach a lot, to create
Right.
a plan based on a pre-existing piece you're playing, and then compose something that
Right.
might end up kind of similar to it, might end up a bit different.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, still a lot of composition teaching is based on the idea of models, and that's
Mm.
always been the place, not just in music, but in other art
Yeah.
forms too. It's just like, gosh, that's a great piece of art. What did they do to do that? Let me find out what they did, and let's try and do it myself. And then, you come to your own way of doing things and what sounds original because all these influences get mixed all up together. At first, your music is going to sound very similar to the two or three sources you're looking at. But when you're looking at 20, 30, 40, then those influences get kind of spread thinly across music, which doesn't sound like any of them closely, but wouldn't exist without them.
Yeah. Yeah. And so speaking of influences there, the guitar has a lot of, cultural roots in a wealth of styles
Mm.
from around the world. There's versatility and rich cultural heritage behind it. So how have you taken advantage
Mm.
of that as a composer?
Well, big time, I think is the answer to that one. It's it's kind of interesting that when we're thinking about the historical context of someone like Segovia, Segovia had a very different problem. In his day, he was trying to make people take the guitar seriously as a classical art instrument, and he didn't want anything to do with the sort of folkloric side of things. And those days, we were very much separated, segregated between sort of the concept of high art classical music and somehow low art popular music. Of course, that's now gone, thank goodness. And there are plenty of pieces doing what might be called popular music, which are a lot more musically sophisticated than other pieces we might have historically called classical music. So those boundaries are not there anymore. And as the world kind of changes and culture develops, suddenly having an instrument which can have cultural roots in popular music, folk music, music from all the different continents on the world, South America, obviously, but also Africa, Asia, and a relationship to lots of different styles and plucked instruments. It means that suddenly the guitar is the ultimate versatile instrument, and it's the classical instruments that are jealous of our rich heritage. You know, I was talking to a violinist who I worked with a lot recently, and he said, well, the guitar really is the best because you're not it's not sort of innocuous having a guitar in any kind of musical situation. It's not sort of out of place. It kind of fits in much more easily. Whereas some of the Western classical instruments are really limited, particularly piano, which is a keyboard. There are just the 12 semitones and that's it, tuned in a particular way. So, things have changed dramatically. We did a thing recently at the Guitar Research Center, and the one fact that came out of it was that there's basically now great statistic there's a guitar on the planet Earth for every 100 people,
Wow.
which seems amazing. I know that you have more than your fair share, but
I'm happy to share them around. So yeah.
yeah,
Mm.
so I think it's great and it gives access to it. And a lot of guitarists who come and so this is going to be a long answer, but a lot of guitarists who come to classical guitar often come through rock or folk or other routes. So in a way, they already have improvising as part of their musical heritage. And it means then you can write music which jumps from style to style, and they'll happily do that. Uh, a recent piece of mine, cocktail list for two guitars. There are 12 different cocktails. Everyone is in a completely different style. It draws on jazz, it draws on Latin music, it draws on, manouche, sort of French style. It draws on all these things. And guitarists can just play all these styles because they've grown up with them, and the repertoire that we have is very diverse culturally, and you've got to be able to play, uh, you know uh, in all these different styles. And you go to a guitar recital, and you might have Dowland, and you might have Leo Brower, and you might have I don't know, Gismonti. You might have arrangements of songs by the Doors. It's an incredible thing, and that sort of richness of repertoire and interchangeability of repertoire. The other classical instruments are very jealous of that, particularly, violin, cello, piano, and voice, where the repertoires are so calcified. They're so sort of stuck in particular ways of doing it, that there doesn't seem quite the same opportunity for them to bring in some folk music or whatever.
Mm.
So I think the guitar's in a very, very good position from that point of view. diversity of cultural roots.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I will admittedly I sometimes am a little bit jealous of, I look at the piano repertoire and
Mm,
violin repertoire and I think, oh, they have such great. But then that's a great perspective there. Yeah, we have our revenge, or those instruments are looking at us, with a little bit of
right.
jealousy, like, oh, you guys get to play Latin American music and
Exactly.
flamenco and also,
And
yeah,
also,
just
and
about
still,
every
and still,
style.
and still, we get to play. We play a lot of Bach.
And we play, and we get the best of, get the best of
There's
everything. Yeah.
nothing better than Bach. So,
Yeah.
one of the things we did in the quartet was arrange music that we just wanted to play. Music that, is from that kind of more traditional classical repertoire. But it is possible to get our hands on this great music. We don't have to leave it to the violins, from Schubert's song accompaniments to even Beethoven piano sonatas and things. It's possible to take this stuff on board too. So we're kind of in a very fortunate position, I think.
Yeah. So I've got a question here, just following on from what you said. You know that a lot of guitarists come from a rock, pop, jazz, contemporary background, and then they'll start playing the classical guitar. Yet there seems to be a little bit of a lack of that mentality, when it comes to composing and arranging, improvising
Mm.
on the classical guitar. So, is
Mm.
there what do you think is there something in the culture that's creating that?
Yeah, it's the pedagogy, it's the teaching, and it's our faults. People like me teaching in conservatories and universities, that's where the fault lies. It's the sort of whole sense of tradition, the whole sense of, you've got to learn this piece, you've got to learn these studies, you've got to play the here's your fingering, off we go. It's a culture of learning, which then weirdly, people kind of shake off often when they get out into the world and start doing creative stuff. They kind of gradually shake it off. Um, but I think that's changing. I think there's definitely a sort of paradigm shift happening in relation to exactly the things you're talking about, improvising, composing, arranging as part of what people do. I think that's really beginning to change, thankfully. So I think, yeah, the reason that it's certainly in there's someone I know who's just done a PhD about violin pedagogy and how that stifles creativity. Essentially, that's massively simplifying it. But the idea of sort of recreating these kind of ideal interpretations, almost walking a tightrope of, oh, that's one crotchet beat too fast, or that's you know that note here is always approached by this kind of rel. So there's a kind of performance traditions which are really suffocating, and also, there's a crazy need for things to be correct and clean, which was never the case in Brahms's time. The performances were, by modern standards, shockingly bad, untogether, not rehearsed, out of tune, the rest of it. We've kind of developed this kind of perfectionist culture. Someone once described it as, it's like playing a sport, trying to exactly recreate the 1966 World Cup final and getting everyone to move precisely as they moved in an area where, freedom and improvisation is kind of how it should be, really. So, you can look at it as a slightly absurdist approach, whereby we were all trying to play the Tchaikovsky violin concerto as well as Vengerov, or as well as, in a way that is the deemed way to play it due to performance tradition. It's um, it's not very healthy if you look at it from that point of view. And one of the things that came out of this research in particular was the idea that, you say to a violinist at 2 in the morning, oh, there's a violin here, can you play us something? And they're like, no, I can't play now. It's 2 in the morning. It's so that the playing the instrument becomes something that is only work and never something that's part of your daily. Well, we're guitarists, someone says to you, here's a guitar at 3 in the morning, and we'll all play something, I
Yep,
think.
happy to.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's getting us to stop that's more of a problem.
That's it.
Um, but yeah, so anyway, so there's a lot packed up in this. I think yeah, it's a big topic.
It is. Maybe we can dive a little bit deeper because
Mm,
I've studied quite a bit of 18th and 19th century guitar method books,
Mm.
and I've found hundreds of pages of harmony exercises.
Yeah.
Probably would even challenge a jazz guitarist of today. Like primary
Mm.
chords up all in every key,
Yeah.
all over the fretboard, the role of the octave in every key,
Yeah.
third, six octaves, tenths in every key. The list just going on and on.
Mm.
So I guess the pedagogy changed at some point to where
Yeah.
we're not really practicing those things or encouraged to.
No, absolutely. I mean, and no one talks about them either. And so, as you say, a lot of these method books not only have all these exercises, they also have, encourage improvisation and composition. And in fact, if you look at the kind of things that people like Carulli, Giuliani, and Saul were writing for these method books, they're all basically written out partimento exercises.
Yeah.
And the other big sort of idea is that, the way that Italian pedagogy worked, composition pedagogy and ear training pedagogy, it was all done through improvisation. So composition was often done through improvising over a given bass line, but by improvising by singing. So, you've got the bass line, you've got the figures, and your composition is taught through improvising in real time over these basses or these exercises. Um, and there's uh and that kind of whole oral tradition was sort of lost when it wasn't really sort of written down very much. And then the kind of German approach, which was very different, kind of took over a lot of music pedagogy. And it's only recently, with a lot more research being done into those early Italian music schools, that we see this whole other much, much more practical approach to pedagogy. So it's you know, I think it's really interesting from that point of view.
Yeah. Mm. On that note, how can someone get started composing if they've never tried before? We've talked
Mm.
about, you've mentioned partimento, and we've thrown out some terms here and there. But if someone's wanting to start, they've never tried before, or they've dabbled a little bit, you got any advice?
Mm. Absolutely. Um, yeah, I spoke to a lot of teachers in Italy about this last year about how you can introduce creativity. I gave them some exercises, which were, the first ones were based on models, like we were talking earlier a little bit about. So take, for example, the first of the simple studies by Leo Bra. And you look at the elements, the compositional elements that are in it, repeated chords, interesting rhythms that are mixtures of groups of twos and threes, and some bass notes. Right, off we go. How can you change this piece to make your version of it? How can you make it better? And so on. But also, with the 19th century stuff, little exercises with open strings and notes on the top three strings. It's like, well, let's move up just take our hand up the instrument. Let's see what sounds good. Let's try doing the same sort of pattern, but a few positions higher. Let's change the fingers. You know, and suddenly you're composing. You can't start from nothing. That's not how it works. It's not as if you're sitting there waiting for inspiration. There's suddenly a sort of thunderbolt from the sky is going to come down, and you're going to write down your piece of genius music. It all just comes from in the same way that you and I are having a casual conversation. We've got some questions down here, but we're not reading a script. We're kind of improvising. We're kind of using the materials we've got and using it as a starting point and moving on from there. So it's always the idea of having some kind of starting point. Jonathan Leithwood does a brilliant video, which is on YouTube, about improvising in Bach. And he looks at the way as you reduce the piece down to its harmonic reduction, its skeleton, and then you fill in notes based on those harmony on that. And he's got various techniques of doing it. So there are techniques of doing it. And in the early stages of composition, improvisation is and composition are the same thing. You're just kind of improvising, but then making selections. So you're improvising, but not in real time. You're improvising in longer time.
Mm.
You're playing some things and think, what do I prefer here? Do I prefer a C or a D? What's the thing? And when it really boils down to it, all that composing is finding good notes. You're on one note. What shall I have next? And it's very easy to worry too much about the final piece. Like a 20-minute sonata or a symphony or whatever. Whereas in fact, the actual composing takes place in the small scale, note to note. I mean, you can have a plan, you can decide that you're going to have a piece that's 5 minutes long, 20 minutes long, whatever, and it's going to do a certain thing. But the fun, creative bit, so almost happens on a note to note basis, you know. And some composers are very, very free like this. Leo Brau, when he starts composing, he has no idea how long the piece is going to be, what it's going to have in it. He just starts. And then after a while, he thinks, oh, maybe I should change now. It's very organic and very simple. Yeah, and there's no great mystery to composing. One of the things again that pedagogy does, it teaches us that there are masterpieces and they're brilliantly put together, and so often um, these are kind of after the event um, reviews that make the music turn the music into something that it really isn't. You know, you can take an example of and Beethoven. Absolutely one of my all-time favorites. Ran a course on late Beethoven a long time. But you can look at, for example, there's something like the Heiliger Dankgesang, which is a movement of the Opus 132 quartet. And it's made up of two kinds of material. One is a sort of based on the Lydian mode thing, and one is a sort of classical thing in 3/8. So one's in F Lydian, one's in D. They have nothing to do with each other. Absolutely nothing. There's no way, if you had a composition student, you'd say, well, that doesn't go with that. What are you doing? What are you playing at here? But he does, and he kind of tries to make it work and then starts adapting and does some crazy things to it. But then it's easy to sort of over egg how far that is away from what anyone else could do. It's not, yeah, it is special, it is Beethoven and so on, but it's just a little bit further down the road. It's not magic. It's not, he doesn't it's not as if it's not reachable by the rest of us. In the same way that, most people imagine they'll write a novel at some point. And they can. It may not be as great as Ian McEwan or Charles Dickens or whatever, but it's possible to do it. It's not as if these things are kind of beyond our comprehension, but sometimes with composition, we feel as if, composition can only be done by composers.
Yeah. Hmm. It's very interesting. It reminds me a bit of the famous quote by Bach: "If anyone is as equally as industrious as I, they would accomplish as much." So just the fact that they put their pen on paper and wrote down some notes and actually composed, and then I think you're right. We over glorify it, and then what that does is then we just think, oh, I'll never be able to do that, so I'll never try, and so
Mm.
a lot of people never try. But when they do try, it's like you're saying, they realize it's not magic. It's just, yeah,
Yeah.
one note at a time, and
Well, and also it's something you get better at the more you do it. And if you've been doing it, and I've turned 60 this year, I've been doing it a very, very long time. So I've got reasonably good at it simply because I've spent a sort of disproportionate amount of my life doing it with other people, you know. Um, and so it's you obviously need, I mean, a number of different sort of factors in order to succeed. I'm sure we'll come on to talking about that kind of thing later. But simply nothing really replaces putting in the hours when it boils down to it.
yeah, similar to practice, similar to
Exactly,
playing an instrument.
exactly. Yeah.
Seems like a lot of your pieces are inspired by literature
Mm.
from what I've seen. So could you maybe expand a little bit on that? And are there any other things that inspire your compositions as well?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think so every piece I've ever written is based on something else in some way. I mean, that's the first thing to say. I don't sort of sit down and think, right, today I'll write a sonata or a fugue and have just purely musical ideas. So often, a piece will start with um, some kind of stimulus, some kind of impetus. And the impetus might be someone saying, I want to commission a piece for this date or whatever. Another impetus might be going to see an art exhibition and thinking, God, that's really amazing. And the thing is, I mean, I've just got this composer's mentality where everything I come across in my life is like, how can I use that in a composition? I mean, everything, literally everything, going to the supermarket. So every book I read, I'm thinking, how could this be a piece? Or every exhibition I go to, or every other piece I see, I think, well, how could I transform this? I mean, I do love arranging. It's a great pleasure because you're starting with something and you think, okay, my job here is to twist it in some way. So, for example, I recently wrote a quintet for guitar and string quartet. It's all based on artworks. And it was an opportunity to take some of my absolute favorite artworks and think, well, what is the sound of this picture? If, if this picture has a soundtrack, what is that? So, for example, there's Edward Hopper's Nighthawks, very famous painting of a couple in a cafe late at night. There's hardly anyone about. It's a kind of study of sort of cities and loneliness. And it's like, so what is the sound? What sound is that generating? So always the imagination is kind of like, how could I turn that into music? So it starts with this sort of imaginative thing, which is, not related to notes or instruments or anything, but sometimes just a mood or a character. And that tends to come from these other things, whether they're landscapes or people or other music or art or literature, you know. And sometimes when I've written educational music, of course, the impetus comes from these are the only notes you can use. What can you create with these notes? So the music itself, those restrictions of the music itself can obviously set me up. But if you were to give me a blank manuscript paper and say, I want you to write something that's not based on anything else, I'd be completely lost. I would have no idea what to do.
Mm.
I was trying to think the other day of, is there anything I do in my life which is genuinely a hobby and has absolutely nothing to do with my composing? I don't kind of eat it and use it for composing. And I guess going to football matches is probably the only thing. And my kind of obsession with Arsenal Football Club. Although in one piece I did write a movement based on the east stand of the old Arsenal Stadium. So I guess even football's not sacred. But it's almost as if, my whole being is the way I interpret the world or kind of reflect back my view of the world is through I suppose translating what I see, what I hear into a composition. That's my kind of way of saying this is my response. With other people, it might be an article or some comments or some speech or a painting or whatever. But for me, that's where it comes from. So, if without that kind of stimulus, I just don't get started. Can't get excited about something.
I remember interviewing Philip Howden, and he was also a visual artist as well as
Mm.
composer, Australian, and he had a theory that music and sound were the same energy. I think he said music is slowed down light, and light is
Mm.
sped up sound. So
Well,
it's
absolutely.
interesting
I
what you're
mean,
saying.
they're all waves. I mean, I do a lot of music that's based on architecture. And there's this idea that, architecture is frozen music or music is liquid architecture, these
Mm.
kinds of parallels. And they are. And there's a lot of, the human brain sort of, is endlessly creative. I mean, this is the great thing about where we are into evolutionarily is that we have this brain, which means that we can just think up crazy stuff. We can imagine for example, we can imagine a purple chocolate mountain, even though we know it's impossible. So it's kind of making these connections and doing these transformations with our imaginations. And yeah, that's why progress is happening at such a ridiculous rate. It's like, well, if you take that and you take that and put them together, maybe you get this. And this is sort of going on exponentially. And the exciting thing I think about being a human is our ability to be creative, to do stuff that interprets what's around us and makes something that helps push the whole thing forward. Of course, it'll end up in our own destruction, but that's inevitable.
Mm. Well, it
Mm.
made me what you said there made me think a little bit of AI and what
Mm.
the future of things there. And but you've also had, as you mentioned, you've had an extended career now in composing. So have you seen any shifts over that period of time, especially I guess with
Yeah.
technology or any
Yeah,
other
absolutely.
factors?
Technology and culturally. I mean, it's the tools that we have now to make music are so much more versatile and easy to use. In the old days, you had to learn an instrument basically. Now you can make incredible music on a laptop using program, using samples, doing all sorts of stuff. And you don't necessarily have to be that competent at playing an instrument.
Mm.
Can't decide if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a different thing. And certainly you can get sort of, if you like, you can be a virtuoso on a laptop. You can be a virtuoso for particular software. Um, and so I think, and also one of the big things that's changed is that if you're working, say, for example, at a workstation and you're making electronic music, you're getting the instant feedback of how the piece will actually sound from your machine all the time. And you're actually playing with the sound that an audience will hear in the same way that Liszt or Chopin would have done, or Paganini when they're playing. They're actually working with the visceral sound of that. Whereas, the composer who's working on pencil and paper, or sort of a bad piano has to, the leap of faith that's required in order to sort of imagine the music is so great that then it makes it much harder for people who don't have a particularly highly developed oral sense.
Mm.
Um, so I think that's good. And it's actually, uh, I think the biggest change, of course, is through the availability of recorded music and how that's changed. I mean, so well, there's lots of things. So when I was studying composition in the 80s at university, high modernism was the order of the day. And if you were to write a dominant seventh chord, you would be, struck off, basically not allowed to practice music ever again. Um, and that has changed massively. Things have become a lot more plural. It's a lot harder to assess the unfamiliar. So again, in performance competitions, that's why, it's very easy to assess people who are all playing the same music. That's dead easy. And the same in composition, if everyone's got the same kind of goals, same objectives, it's very easy to be able to kind of, if you like, rank them or say that's working, that's not working. But as soon as this kind of multiple diversity happens, and that you can write in whatever style you want, be influenced by whatever you want from whenever you want. That's the thing that started with recording, has kind of massively exploded with the internet, is that everything is available. On this machine on which I'm talking to you, I can access virtually every piece of music ever recorded.
Mm.
Just here at home. Don't have to go anywhere. When I was a student, undergraduate student, and I wanted to hear something by a Japanese composer, I had to order a special import CD from Japan, which had already cost, $30, and then pay $15 postage and $20 import duty. And then you just want to hear what it's like, and you hear it and you think, okay, well, that's that. Whereas now I can just go to Spotify and it's all there, and I can be influenced by all this stuff.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a very different landscape.
Mm.
More exciting, but also more confusing.
Yeah. Yeah. I, I guess there can be challenges with when we're oversaturated with things. Sometimes we can get overwhelmed and lose focus, and so very interesting. Um, Talking about more about your career, what principles have enabled you to flourish as a musician making music professionally?
Hmm. Well, I have to say the biggest thing is luck. Biggest thing is you can't control that. I mean, there are certain things you can do, but I've been very lucky in terms of the environment in which I was born. I was brought up in South Wales, and at the time, the government put a lot of money into music education. I'd go to school and be like, which instrument do you want to learn? Okay, you start on Monday. Here's your free violin. Here's your free lessons. Off you go. Then on Friday we meet for orchestra, and then you kind of get into this thing. And there's a kind of normalization of this kind of music education. That it's like stuff that everyone does, in the same way that everyone plays soccer or everyone plays, you know, rugby in the UK. It's just part of the school thing. You don't think, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? It's just part of the culture. So that was very, very lucky. And it's much harder if you don't have that environment around you. You don't have peers who are interested in the same thing you're interested in. And then, of course, good teaching and supportive parents, parents who allow you to become a musician if you want to, you know, basically say, well, what is it that excites you? Let's encourage that. That kind of, and as a child growing up, there's nothing better than that. It's just like if you're passionate about something, the worst thing that could possibly happen is for someone to tell you you can't do it. Um, you know, and so allowing the space to do that. So, I mean, that's those things are very important. But beyond all that, beyond the sort of good teaching and the sort of ability to work hard and whatever, by far the most important thing is resilience. I think, your um, sense of self-worth, self-confidence, and resilience in adversity is absolutely key to any success. Um, I've got a friend, she's a composer, and she has a failure CV on her website, which I think is brilliant. Because you look at other people and it seems like everyone's super successful all the time. But of course, it's not like that. It's just what you're shown. So, there have been various projects I've wanted to do, various things I was very excited. We got very close to doing, then the finance falls through, or then this doesn't happen, or, you know, and you're going to get rejected all the time at every stage of your career, even now. And so being resilient to that and being able to accept that that's just what happens and you have no control over that. Because as soon as you start either taking it personally or getting upset about it or worried about it, um, then that kind of drags you down and that makes you feel less confident about what you want to do. I mean, I think the only reason I'm a composer is because I kind of refuse to do anything else. It was like, no, I'm going to compose. That's it. I mean, I had, at various times in my life, I'd have kind of options that were safer and better paid.
Mm.
Um, but I always had that kind of sense of, no, actually, I want to be a composer. That's what I want to do. And I think if you want it enough and you work hard and you kind of um, are not sort of knocked back by constant rejection, then it's very possible, really possible.
That's awesome.
Um,
Awesome advice. Yep, go on.
Yeah, but I think it is tricky because we all feel like imposters. We've all got imposter syndrome. We all feel as if, and also when you're in the middle of writing a piece, you feel particularly bad about it. We all do. There'll be a stage where you've got a deadline coming up and you've got to write the piece. So you have this wonderful early part of creativity where you're fantasizing about how great the piece is going to be. And then at some point, you've actually got to start writing it.
Mm.
And there may be an initial bit of flow of energy and excitement, but then you'll always hit a bad spot where you kind of lose confidence in your ability to finish it. You wonder how you've ever finished a piece before. You think, this time it's finally kind of, you're going to be found out as the charlatan that you are. And we all feel this in every piece. John Adams said the same thing in an interview, or in his book, Alleluia Junction. Exactly the same thing. And then, of course, you come out of it at the other end, and then you hear people play your music. And then, of course, when the performers get hold of it, it sounds marvelous. It sounds absolutely great. So you kind of come out of it. But I suppose it's being resilient and seeing resilience as a kind of an important sort of career option. And then one more thing is building up a huge number of personal contacts,
Mm.
just knowing everybody. If you're a player or a composer, which is just hanging around at gigs, getting to meet people, talking to people, kind of doing that social thing and building up a thing. And so people know who you are. Then they might see you play in a competition 2 years later and go, oh yeah, I remember that guy who was at that concert, or I remember her, she was doing this thing. And then you kind of build up these long-term relationships. Which then always lead to something. And, there's kind of people tend to only employ musicians or composers who they know and trust.
Yep.
Everyone is good. Everyone is good enough.
Mm.
There's no point locking yourself into a room trying to become a better composer or a better violinist only. Yes, you've got to do all that, practice all that work, but people have got to know you. They've got to have met you and, had coffee with you, had a beer with you. And just making those personal connections is absolutely key.
That is brilliant career advice there. Really great resilience, contact, networks, and building
Mm.
relationships. And I have to say, I've had my definitely could have a very long list of CV failures.
Mm.
Um, so I think yeah, anyone when you do persist with something, yeah, that's just kind of inevitable, and you just gotta um, yeah, sort of use the love that you have for what we do. You
Mm.
must have a love for composing, and like you said, just you you don't see yourself sort of doing anything else. And yeah, I feel very very similar with the guitar. I just love playing the guitar, and
Mm.
I just can't see myself doing anything else. So
Mm.
um, yeah, wonderful advice there.
No, I mean, I think it's really important, especially, as people get older and you see people around you who are very disillusioned with and they find work a chore and they kind of live for their evenings and weekends.
Yeah.
And it's kind of, I mean, not, I mean, a lot of people love their work, but it's something that, if you're a musician, obviously aspects of the work are a bit dull and there are sort of downsides, but on the whole, you're basically engaging with what it is that kind of fires you up. Um, and whatever that happens to be, I think that's very important.
Yeah. Maybe we'll move on to your latest project. So you had an album recently released back in October of 2024, Landscape and Memory.
Yeah.
You described it as your most ambitious program to date. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, earlier in my career, I'd sort of, make the effort of making whole albums of my music, put them out there. But then lots of other people have played it, so there'd be a piece on this album, piece here, piece there, piece wherever. And things would sort of happen quite randomly without me kind of curating anything. It's just, oh, this project now is over here. And then around, I think, 2007, 2008, I thought to myself, well, we've got this project happening, got all these performances lined up. We must record this piece now when it's happening. Don't know what album it's going to go on, don't know where it's going to be. We just got to get it in the can. So then that can got bigger and bigger. And then, I looked to releasing a single album actually. And then thought, well, there's just too much stuff to go on that. Then it became a double, and the next thing I knew, it was like nearly 4 hours of music, basically. It's 3 hours, 47 minutes or something ridiculous like that. All collected in the same place. It's incredibly diverse. There's nothing that unites it. There's no kind of unifying factor other than general themes that my music is about. Landscape and memory. I write a lot about landscape, place. Memory, I write a lot about time. I'm kind of fascinated with memory, and lots of the pieces kind of have that element in them. But always my own personal goal is to make my music as different as possible to itself. People often talk about, oh, it's important to find your voice as a composer. I don't think so. I think, because it's you composing, people will hear your voice because your technique is an inevitable part of what you do. And it's actually the flaws in it. Sometimes people sound original when they try to sound like someone else and fail at doing that.
Yeah, I've seen
Um,
it.
and so I sort of see, and I also see, uh, and what I suppose what this project does, it puts all these things in one place. So they're all very, very different projects. The piece I wrote for Aniello Desiderio is basically kind of a fantasy on opera themes from Puccini and Verdi. And these people, on the other hand, I've got a very dark piece for flute and electronics, which is kind of based on one of the oceans of the moon. There's a piece for violin piano, which kind of explores, um, invocation and the Islamic call to prayer. There's just this huge range of different stuff. And it's just nice to see it all in one place because it's a bit like having an exhibition of my work as if I was an artist. I don't want to use the word retrospective because nearly everything in the album is new. Last few years, sort of majority of it is post-pandemic. But it's like that idea of sort of seeing, almost as if a lot of work by the same person in the same place. So ambitious from that point of view. And I did curate it in as much as there are things that are not on the album, which are recorded but didn't make the final cut. And then a couple of projects that were kind of accelerated in order to get onto the album. Um, so it's just nice to kind of make a statement. And also I turned 60 this year. And that was another sort of moment to think, okay, so what does that mean? What does turning 60 mean? Um, Time to sort of take stock of where I am, what I'm doing, and think about, where to go next. So there's lots of kind of in jokes in the project. The cover is a lot of lines which look like a landscape, look like the sea, look like brainwaves. But of course, there are 60 of these lines to celebrate the 60th birthday, this kind of stuff. Um, so yeah, it's a kind of, I suppose, a sort of a landmark recording, a sort of a placemaker, and sort of say, okay, this is where I am now. This is it. So if people say to me, tell me about your music, I'll be like, well, go and listen. This
Mm.
triple album basically tells you all you need to know. Everything is here.
Yeah,
Everything's yeah.
that's great. I love that perspective because I think I fall into that trap even of thinking that I have to find my own voice. Like this is how I
Mm,
am as a composer. But what you said there, that's really illuminating to kind of say, we don't have to. Why should we limit ourselves when we
mm,
can write? Especially today. I mean, there's so many things we can be influenced by, so many styles, so many genres, so many,
Mm.
with technology and everything. So you've also written for a lot of different instruments. On the album, we have concerto for theorbo,
Mm.
piece for organ, work for guitar and forte piano, string quartet. So how have you learned to write for such a diverse range of instruments?
Well, I guess, I mean, I did, um, I taught orchestration for many years at the university and studied all these things, doing composition as my kind of major. I did a composition doctorate and the rest of it. So, and through writing, I mean, when you write for an instrument, you learn an enormous amount about it, and working with particular players over a period of time. I played violin and viola as a youngster. That certainly helps with the string writing. And in fact, it's very interesting that um, the majority of the other instruments on this album are string instruments. There's a lot of violin, viola, cello, bass on the album. Um, you know, but I mean, you kind of, as a composer, I remember talking to a friend of mine once, Mark Anthony Turnage, and he was amazed at the idea of a guitarist composer. He said, "What do you mean a guitarist composer? You mean they only write guitar music?" I'm like, "Well, yeah." And he's like, "Well, that's a bit weird, isn't it? I mean, if you're a composer, you compose. Why would you limit yourself to one instrument?" Um, uh, and I can kind of sort of understand that. And I think it's writing for lots of different instruments, and particularly different people. That's another key factor. Really shapes the sort of work that I do. I mean, one thing which we kind of mentioned in the preamble was the idea that, I write differently for different guitarists. It's not that I just write it for the guitar in a particular way. But absolutely, I mean, for me, being a composer is about fulfilling commissions. So someone asks you for something, and it's very bespoke. So, let's take two guitarists. Like I said, let's say David Russell and Zoran Dukic, both incredible artists, but very different. So, for David, we'll talk about what he's interested in, what his musical interests are. I also think about his playing. So. Um, in fact, I'm writing a new piece for both of them at the moment, which is why it's in my head. Um, is that, with David, he has a very strong link with Galicia in northwestern Spain. So the music I sort of chose to sort of work on comes from the old Camino to the cathedral in Santiago. Some of the melodies that he knew based on that, and use a lot of the things that his technique is very good at, cross-string trills, particular sort of types of clean playing, types of rhythmic sort of stuff. That's very, very David and very suited to the sound of the daemon and his instrument.
Mm.
Um, Zoran Dukic is very, very different. He's a very much more uh, sort of improvisatory, um, creative guitarist. Not quite so disciplined in the sense of kind of, with David, there's a solidity about what he does. With Zoran, it's much more creative in terms of you don't know what you're going to get. He'll get on stage and almost think to himself, "So, what tempo tonight?
Mm.
What fingering tonight? What color tonight?" And in a way, you kind of give him a stimulus. So the last piece I wrote for him was based on cinema. And, one of those examples I was talking earlier where a performer just takes the piece to places I hadn't even thought of. Not changing notes, but just thinking of character, gesture, color, all these things that just the musical surface basically totally transformed. So I approach them very differently. Shu Fei Yang, again, very different kind of approach, very different sort of player. And it helps me try to keep the music fresh, different. I think as a composer, especially the older you get, it becomes very easy to repeat yourself. You just see, and it becomes very effortless. Oh, I'll just do another piece like that. And before you know it, you're churning out identikit pieces. Um, and this is what I'm desperately trying to avoid.
Yeah, it's great. It's a great way to get outside of that kind of box, because if you're writing for yourself all the time, I can see that happening. If I'm always writing for myself, you'd get into certain patterns, certain ways of doing things. But like when you consider how other people approach things and the guitar and maybe even other instruments too, I can see how that would really expand your horizons. So
Mm.
That's wonderful.
And also the musical tastes of the people, what music they're interested in, can
Yeah.
affect the kind of style of things that I write, the kind of concert they do, how it would fit into it. So yeah, I see the composer not necessarily as this great sort of genius, but someone who's a pragmatist, someone who's just working, like guitar builders do, or like people who design houses, buildings, architects, that kind of you're doing it for a reason, not just to sort of serve your own sort of egotistical fantasies about what you think the future of music is.
Wow.
My ambitions are much more modest than that.
Mm. And what is next on the horizon for you? Do you have any? You mentioned David Russell and Zoran Dukic writing for them. Any
Yeah.
other projects as
So
well?
at this precise moment, these days, I'm doing some arrangements for Decca for Alexandra Whittingham, some
Mhm.
arrangements of sort of French classical and popular music. I'm writing a community piece for an ensemble called Wago, which is in the West Country, which involves amateurs, but with a couple of professionals on top. Writing a lute duet for Nigel North,
Oh, nice.
a duo actually for the Davison Duo, who are a young duo based in California. It's all guitar based at the moment, a lot of stuff. A duo for Andrew Zone. Um, just finished a duo for Lucio Marazzo, which is premiering this coming week, which is called Aphorisms, which are tiny, tiny little pieces, just a few seconds long. Um, yeah, and then yeah, there's a lot of stuff, but it's a stretching out. And Marco Tamaya, I've got to write a piece for him. There's lots of others too. I've got a long list, basically.
That's
Not all in the next 3 months. This is spread over some time. So it's
okay. Okay, that sounds like a lot. Yeah, I was thinking, how do you have the time to uh, to do all of that? That's
well, I mean, it's just yeah. I mean, of course, you get deadlines that come sooner than you want, and you find yourself working ridiculously hard for them.
okay.
But it's they are spread out, and I do spend a lot of my week composing. So it's the stuff at the university, I'm basically just supervising doctoral students. Royal
Mm.
Academy is 1 day a week. I travel a lot, which I love to do, festivals, meet people, and do all that kind of stuff. But I do, try and ring fence quite a bit of time just to sit in this room making music, basically.
Very good. Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Steve. I really enjoyed hearing from you today. I learnt a lot. I have a lot of food for thought for myself, and I hope I'm sure all the listeners will really enjoy your discussion here. So, thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Daniel. I mean, I must admit, great questions, and you can only have a conversation like this if you're sort of pushed in particular directions. So it felt like a very exciting and safe space to exchange some of these ideas. So thank you for that very much.
No, I'm glad. Appreciate it. Thanks so much.